Okay, so thanks for joining us, everyone. As as you're probably aware, this is the kind of um, next webinar in our series of everything you wanted to know about particular employment HR topics. And today our subject is flexible working requests, and we'll touch on a bit of the kind of cultural benefits and the way things are changing and the expectations around flexible working. We'll touch on that, but there'll also be a lot of practical detail about how we handle and how we deal with flexible working requests. Now, as always, we like to keep things interactive if we can. So please do feel free to chip in any questions you might have, raise your hand, any comments in the box, whatever you want to do. Please do just interject and we can have a chat. But without kind of further ado, we'll dive straight into the subject. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about everything you wanted to know about flexible working requests. These have been a useful tool for employees, in particular for many years. Stereotypically, perhaps, or typically, you might say, these are seen to kind of benefit or historically benefited working parents and particularly working mothers, particularly returning from periods of maternity leave, etc., where there was an ability to request changes to working patterns, working arrangements. But more recently, and as things change in society as well, but more recently with the kind of changes of the pandemic and the various lockdowns, we've also seen pretty big changes to working practice generally. And so we're seeing a new approach to flexibility in working life, a lot more of an expectation of balancing work life and home life. And so this concept of flexible working requests is becoming ever more popular. It's certainly not going to get any less popular. And it's actually been embraced by both employers and employees. But nevertheless, there is a kind of well set out legal framework to it. So I thought it would first be useful just to explain and summarize what exactly we're talking about when we're mentioning flexible working requests. Some of this may be very familiar to some of the people on the call, and for others it might not be quite as familiar. So it's always useful to have a reminder on these things. So what is a flexible working request? Well, in summary, any employee who has at least 26 weeks continuous service has a statutory right under the Employment Rights Act to make an application or a request to change their working terms and conditions. They can make a request to their employer to consider a flexible working arrangement. Now, this typically relates to, or the statutory right, extends to requesting changes in relation to how many hours an employee works, when they work them, where they work them. That last one is becoming, obviously, as we can imagine, the much more common, getting more and more common in terms of requests. People asking to continue with home working arrangements, hybrid working arrangements that were perhaps put in place temporarily during the pandemic. So that can form part of a flexible working request. Now, as a useful illustration, ACAS have set out what are, in their experience, the most popular requests which are made by employees under the working time legislation. And these are, as you might expect, to reduce hours, perhaps from full-time to part-time, to change start and finish times, so as to kind of vary when you actually work, even if you work similar hours, to have flexibility with start and finish times, so slightly different from changing start and finish times, but actually having a degree of flexibility within your start and finish times on an ad hoc basis, and that's something that people often refer to as flexi time. Seeing more and more requests for compressing hours, so working the same number of hours over fewer days during the working week, and working from home or in alternative locations, or as we call it, remote working. And job share requests are becoming more common as well. That's where perhaps a role that would previously have been carried out by one individual is split across two individuals carrying out two sides to the same role. And similarly, within the bounds of a flexible working request, employees might ask for the change that they're requesting to be applicable to every day that they work, maybe only to specific days or shifts that they work, It could relate to specific weeks throughout the year. So, for example, during school term time or during school holidays, they may ask to kind of vary their hours according to that to fit around their childcare commitments. And some people may ask for a request to apply only for a limited period of time. So they don't necessarily want it to be permanent. They want to just have a temporary change to their working pattern, perhaps to deal with a particular issue that's affecting their lives for a period of time. So that's a rough kind of outline of what a flexible working request is when we talk about that and how it typically looks. And I'm going to pass over now to Julie, who's going to take us through some of the detail on who specifically is entitled to make those kind of requests.
Thanks, Gareth. Morning, everyone. So yeah, as Gareth says, I'm just going to kind of cover who's eligible to make a statutory request. So an individual can make a statutory request, and that's obviously under the legislation. I mean, any employee could make a flexible working request, but we're talking about specifically under the legislation, their right to make it. So they have to be an employee, and they have to have at least 26 weeks, 6 months continuous service. They can't be an agency worker unless that agency worker is returning from a period of parental leave. And crucially, they have not made a statutory request for flexible working during the previous 12 months. All employees have the right to make the request, whatever their circumstances and whatever their purpose in making the request. They don't have to have a particular reason. It doesn't have to be related to childcare or care of anyone in their family, for instance. And the employee's purpose in making the request is now no longer relevant to the exercise of the statutory right. Although obviously, if you delve into the reasons that an employee is making the request, that can sometimes influence the employer's discretion as to whether or not you're going to agree to the request, how hard you're going to try and accommodate it. So making a statutory request, what does the employee have to do? So an eligible employee has to make a flexible working request by saying that it's a request under the legislation, specify the change that the employee would like to make. Obviously, that's quite crucial. You've got to explain what it is they want you to accommodate. They've got to give a date, a proposed date as to when they would like the change to happen. Some employees, for instance, I made my flexible working request while I was still expecting my first child 14 years ago. So it was before even my maternity leave. So I didn't obviously want it to start until after my maternity leave, which was nearly a year down the road. And some people can be quite tactical about when they make it, because obviously if you make it as an employee and it's refused, you've got to wait another 12 months. So you'll find some employees make it very early so that if it's refused, they can come back again in another 12 months and make it again, perhaps with some amendments. It has to be made in writing, and they also have to explain, quite a lot expected of the employee. They have to explain how they think the change will affect the employer, and if there are any issues that may arise, how that could potentially be dealt with. And they've obviously got to state whether they've made a previous request, and it's got to be dated. Because of all these kind of crucial pieces of information, many employers provide a template form for employees to use. They can quite often maybe put it in a handbook, or it's accessible through HR. And that simplifies the process for employees, and it also ensures that you as the employer are provided with all the relevant information at the earliest opportunity. And I would certainly not advise that you reject a request due to a failure to meet any of these requirements. For instance, if they've forgotten to date it or something. And I would suggest even at that stage, you kind of enter into a dialogue to say, we need a bit more information from you for this request to be taken forward, and elicit the further information again at that stage.
I think that's a good point, Julie, because one thing that often gets missed from the flexible working requests from the employee is that part that you mentioned about how's it going to impact the business, and there being a bit of an obligation or an onus on the employee to actually have a think about that. That's an easy one for the employee to miss because they're not really thinking about the wider picture. Understandably, they're thinking about their own needs, their own requirements. Completely understand that, but they're not necessarily thinking about the extra part of it. I wouldn't necessarily be recommending to businesses to get hung up on the fact that, well, you've not thought about the bigger picture, you haven't included it in your letter, so we're not considering it. Because really that's ultimately going to be your responsibility as the business to consider that. But it does give you the opportunity, at least in those discussions, to ask the employee, do they have any ideas about this? How do they think that's going to impact? Because it can be easy for the employee to say that me changing to these hours is not going to have any impact on the business, etc., etc. And that's going to very rarely be the case. There's going to be some impact. It doesn't mean it can't be managed or dealt with or mitigated in some way. But it can open up that kind of discussion about it, to have a realistic conversation that, yeah, we're trying to consider this request, but we do have to remind everyone that we're thinking about this from the needs of the business as well as the needs of the employee. So I always think that's quite a useful reminder point, that there is actually there's an expectation the employee should do it, but that also gives you every right to have that discussion on a business level.
Great. And I think, Gareth, you're going to kind of expand on how an employer should respond once a request has been made.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So yeah, once you've received the request and then it's sort of taken us through how that request should look from the employee, the obligation then turns over to the employer on how you actually deal with that request. Now we do have quite a broad or a wide-ranging phrase that governs how us as employers are supposed to deal with that request, and that is to deal with it in quotes, a reasonable manner. Now, we're going to come on to kind of what that means, but it tells you that there's quite a wide scope for consideration of those types of requests. So the first and foremost obligation on the employer is to deal with things in a reasonable manner. Secondly, they must notify the employee of the decision on the request within a period known as the decision period. That's typically within 3 months. Julie's going to take us on to later on in today's session about how that can look and how that can be extended, etc. But within that decision period, you must respond to the request, and you must only refuse, or you can only refuse a request if you consider it that one or more of the specific defined grounds for refusal apply. I'm going to go into them again as well in detail as well. But just as an outline, you've got to deal with things reasonably, you've got to deal with things relatively quickly, and you've got to be very clear on your reasons for refusing if you do and you have only a limited grounds for doing that. Clearly, many employers will have a well set out procedure, usually within a specific policy within their employee handbook that says this is how the process will be dealt with. And there may be a degree of flexibility as well within that. For example, if it's quite easy to accept a request, you may not need to go through a full process of having a meeting, etc., because it's quite easy to confirm that it's agreed. But in most cases, you'll need to have some form of formal meeting as well. Now, just again expanding on that phrase around dealing with requests in a reasonable manner, what exactly does that mean? Well, we don't necessarily have too much guidance in the statute as to what that means. We're just told in very broad terms that you must deal with it reasonably. But obviously, as businesses and that may mean different things for different people. But also, we do have some guidance from various cases and codes of practice that tell us how we're supposed to deal with that. Generally speaking, how we, again, we'll come on to this in a bit more detail, but how we see dealing with things in a reasonable manner is to view things with a positive mindset. It's to take on board the request, not with a closed mind, where you're looking for ways to reject it, but really with a kind of positive mind to see how can this work, can it work, and deal with that in a positive way. That doesn't mean accepting every request, but it just means going into things with an open mind. That's usually the best practice for dealing with that and demonstrating that you've dealt with it reasonably. And equally simple things around having a proper discussion, having a proper meeting if that's required, being very transparent with the employee about what we're talking about and what we're trying to do to accommodate it, are all things that go towards demonstrating that you've responded in a reasonable manner. And also simple things like responding in a timely manner, not just receiving a request and not acknowledging it for weeks or months, leaving people in limbo, not knowing what's happening. Communication and things like that will all be really, really important. Difficult to put our finger exactly on what would be reasonable in every single case, but like lots of aspects of employment law, it will be around the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and what would reasonably be expected of our type of business, of our size, etc. I'm going to pass back to Julie. Julie's going to take us through the timetable for dealing with those requests that I mentioned earlier.
Thanks, Gareth. So, yeah, the employer, once it receives the request, the clock does start ticking, and it must notify the employee of its final decision on the employee's request for flexible working within what's called the decision period. And the decision period for a given request begins on the date that the request is made and ends at the end of the period of 3 months. So you've essentially got 3 months beginning with the date that the request is made. Or you could increase the length of the decision period if both parties agree. So the employer and the employee obviously can agree. And any extension of the decision period beyond the 3 months obviously must be agreed, and there needs to be compliance with the above conditions as to timing. But ultimately, the extension could be indefinite, really, but I don't think that really serves the employee or the business. So you are wanting to kind of use that 3 month guideline where possible to make a request, to make a decision on the request. Normally within that time, you would be having a meeting with the employee, talking through in detail the information that they've made in their letter, and obviously then explain to them that you'll get back to them with the decision. And that meeting's normally a good point to ask them and kind of figure out if there are going to be negative impacts on the business, how they can be ameliorated, how these can be kind of reduced. And quite often you do find that employees know and have quite useful suggestions. They're obviously on the ground, and they can kind of collaborate with you to get around any blockers. And as Gareth said earlier, there are various grounds for refusing a request that have been outlined in the legislation, and Gareth's going to look at them in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah. So as we said earlier, if we respond to a flexible working request within the required time, if our decision ultimately is to refuse or reject a statutory flexible working request, we must, as the employer, only do so for one of what is a limited list of reasons. So that's useful to bear in mind, because it's not just a free decision by the employer. It's not just any reason it sees fit. It has to be something that fits within a specified list of reasons. Now, I'm going to take us through those reasons. I'd be interested at the end of that to hear what people think about these reasons, because in some ways the language used sounds really specific, but when you get to the end of the list, most people's feeling is that it's quite wide-ranging, and it covers more or less every permutation of a business reason that you might need. So just going through that list, and I will read these because it's a lot of words. The one reason on the list is the burden of additional costs. So if making that change is going to put the business under more financial cost, that can be a reason to reject a request. Detrimental effect on ability to meet customer demand. So this typically comes in when people make a request to change their hours, but might mean that you're unable to kind of meet the busy times for your customers. So times when orders need to go out, or when there's a rush in store or something like that, that could have an impact. So if the change would have a detrimental effect on your ability to meet customer demand, you can refuse a request. Inability to reorganize work among existing staff. So if you're not able to swap things around and have people cover and things like that. That could come into it. Inability to recruit additional staff. So you may not be able to immediately replace the hours that the employee is no longer able to do or not able to do at that particular time. Detrimental, detrimental impact on quality and detrimental impact on performance. Two similar reasons there, but that's to do with if hours were to change, would there be an impact, a detrimental impact on the kind of output of the business or the performance of the team or the individual involved. Insufficiency of work during periods the employee proposes to work. Sometimes you see people making requests where they ask to switch around their hours to work during times that are really quiet for a business, and it wouldn't make sense for you to have someone working then, or have anyone or have more people working then. So that can come into it. And the last one being a planned structural changes. For example, the employee intended to reorganize or change the business, and that the request doesn't fit with these plans. Not necessarily any specific guidance in the legislation that tells us, how far in advance you've got to have those things planned. But clearly, as a business, if you're already planning to change things around and a request comes in that it goes against those, then that gives you scope to reject, to refuse the request. Now, if you do choose to refuse the request and you do cite one of those reasons, the best practice is always going to be, as the employer, to make sure that you tell the employee exactly why, with specific reference to the reason, so they can see that you're doing it within statutory requirements, and also explain why you feel that those apply. So a letter that simply points to one of the reasons in the legislation is not necessarily going to be an ideal explanation for all sorts of reasons. There's going to be much better practice to demonstrate that you've considered it, you think it falls within one of the categories, to refuse it, and here's why. And that potentially gives the employee an opportunity to appeal or challenge that decision, which again is all part and parcel of the approach of dealing with things reasonably and showing that you've been very clear about this. And always with these things, it's a business. It's business balancing with the needs of their employees. So the more you can do to demonstrate your reasoning and your thought process, the much stronger position you're in, and conversely, the harder it is for the employee to challenge or allegedly be unreasonable. Now, given the breadth of the legitimate reasons for refusing a request, I think it's fair to say that in most cases it won't necessarily be that difficult for the employer, if it wants to justify a decision to reject the request. However, it's important not just to simply think, well, it's quite easy to reject, so we'll just point to a reason and then that's the end of it. Clearly, the other things are often at play when it comes to these kind of requests. So you must always bear in mind the potential for discrimination, the potential for unfair dismissal claims, which would be of much greater significance commercially and legally within that context. So these things do interact. So it's worth bearing in mind the bigger picture, even if you need to refuse a request. Now, although obviously we can see that if any employer considers things closely enough, it'll generally always be able to find a reason to refuse a request. This may not always be the best decision for the business in the immediate to short term, and there can obviously be many more benefits in accommodating requests, and that's why we always recommend that as a kind of best practice approach, and certainly in the spirit of dealing with things in a reasonable manner, that employers really should, and I mentioned this earlier, but just mentioning it again, that employers should approach flexible working requests in good faith. So with an open mind, looking at things positively, demonstrating a way of showing that we're going to try and look at ways to accommodate this where we can, and only refuse it where we can't. And an extension of that, really, in best practice, is to includes proposing alternative flexible working arrangements. So, for example, you see this happen quite often. An employee makes a particular request and it can't quite be accommodated, either in part or in whole. So a good employee would be well placed to explain that, but sort of offer alternatives. So yeah, we can't grant your whole request, but we can grant part of it. we can't do it for forever, but we can do it for a temporary period of time. We can't do it for the whole week, but we can do it for 1 or 2. We can't half your hours, but we can cut them down to 2/3. Things like that can all demonstrate that you're dealing with things reasonably. Makes it much more difficult for employees to challenge your decision. And there's also lots more kind of HR and cultural benefits to taking that kind of approach. And I'm going to pass you over to Julie, who's going to take us through a bit of a run through of a few of those as to why, as a business, you might see actual benefits to flexible working.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. I think given what Gareth was saying, I think we can all agree that if you look hard enough, you will be able to find a reason ultimately to refuse a request if that's what you're wanting really to achieve. But although that sometimes may seem to be for the best for the business in the immediate to short term, there can be benefits in having a more accommodating outlook to such requests. And certainly we're seeing as we've mentioned, a huge change in the workforce and attitudes to working practices. And it does seem to be filtering down to both employees and employers and giving them certain benefits. So, the benefits include things like productivity and effectiveness. They quite often say, if you want something done, ask a busy person. So if you have an employee who's reduced their hours or their days, that certainly was my experience. I reduced from 5 days to 3 days. And I think I probably did become a bit more effective, and maybe there was a bit less chatting. You find that ultimately, if you need to get it done in a shorter period of time, you quite often do manage it. That's not to say you overload someone and expect them to do the same amount of work, but there's definitely a happy medium. Obviously benefits for employees, especially in this day and age. They can save money. They spend less time and money commuting, especially if they're doing fewer days or they're working from home some of the days. Generally, a cultural change to reduce presenteeism quite often has a positive effect on morale and on employee relations in general. Increased flexibility in terms of hours of work, with managers happy for workers to adjust their start and finish times. So again, it can kind of enhance that manager-employee relationship. Permanent home workers sometimes feel better included in work matters than in normal times, because people make actually more of an effort to catch up, to communicate, to include. You can find that there's improved mental well-being and physical fitness. People maybe have time now to walk the dog or go for a walk at lunchtime, or they don't have such a long trip home, and therefore they just manage to kind of decompress and go back, to work-life balance, spending time with families, other activities. They're saying, I don't know if this is true, I'd like to think it's true in my house anyway, better division of childcare, housework, schooling responsibilities. If two parents are at home a little bit more often together, you kind of spread that. And distance from unresolved work issues. So if you maybe have a couple of colleagues who don't get on that well, literally the reduced contact can help. See a few giggles here. So there are all sorts of different aspects that maybe don't immediately present themselves that can have cultural benefits. But of course,
on that, Julie, sorry to interrupt. I was talking to someone recently that point about presenteeism and also the kind of absence levels in their business. They were sort of explaining that as they became more positive towards flexible working, they had more part-time workers, and they granted a few requests. And this was a small business, so they could easily kind of look at the number of days, but they'd actually been able to kind of measure their absence levels and see that the actual completely days lost that they were still potentially paying people for, or paying company sick pay out when people weren't working, versus in the kind of year before they had this increase in kind of flexible working as we came out of the pandemic. The offset of actually granting some of these requests was not as impactful as they initially thought. So they initially thought, well, okay, productivity is going to go down, costs are going to go up, so I'm going to have to recruit different people at different times. But actually, when they offset that against the reduction in kind of absenteeism, and the costs that were going out of the business for that reason, it just balanced out much more. So they were able to see that because they were a smaller employer, so they could see, well, last year we lost this many days, and actually we still paid out this much as a result. Versus this year we lost much fewer. Okay, different people weren't working at different times, but we weren't paying them at that time. So they were able to do a bit of an exercise and work that out. And they just completely opened their eyes to being a lot more flexible as a worker, because employees were happier, getting the rest they needed, getting the balance they needed. They didn't need to leave. They need to quit the job to find someone else that would accommodate those hours. So recruitment and retention was massive as well. So doesn't suit everybody, but clearly, if you can look at the positives of it, that there are ways of adapting to kind of the new way of doing things that can be of benefit.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Not just about retaining employees who are skilled and know your organisation well, but obviously makes you more attractive quite often for recruitment. I mean, I was actually genuinely thinking, I don't think I know many people now who work what I would describe as your traditional and standard Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Especially if you start to include home working or hybrid working. My husband's on compressed hours. Most of my friends, not just female friends, have had alterations to their working life, and so it does become almost noteworthy if an employer is not willing to accommodate that, and it can make that employer less attractive as a place to work. But of course, whilst there are benefits, there can be potential problems and things to kind of get ahead of, issues to consider. If you have particularly an increase in home working or hybrid working, you've got to make sure that there's adequate IT and computer systems to accommodate the employee at home. Otherwise, any benefit to productivity is going to be lost. And obviously you have employees who can feel quite disconnected from work colleagues if the employer, again, isn't kind of keeping in touch and inclusive strategy. Difficulty adjusting to remote working. Again, I don't think this is so prevalent now, but initially I think people found it difficult to have Zoom meetings rather than face-to-face, not just because of IT issues, but again, if there's an important conversation to be had and you're both kind of talking over each other, and you can come away feeling that you didn't really have that proper kind of communication. So again, that's a kind of skill almost to learn, which I think generally people are doing, but it's something to note that it does kind of change circumstances of meetings and communication sometimes. Obviously, people can feel lonely, isolated, unsupported, which can have a detrimental impact on mental health. People can find a difficulty in switching off. Obviously, if you're working from the kitchen table and then you're having dinner at the kitchen table, you can still be kind of maybe going over work in a way that you maybe wouldn't if you had that kind of commute home, that decompression time. Juggling work and childcare, caring responsibilities, that can be difficult, and providing, particularly, I think this is quite a big one, junior members of staff, trainees, apprentices, with suitable training and support if they're not in the office and seeing their colleagues and ways of working. There are obvious things that you need to train younger employee, or not necessarily younger, but more junior members of the team in. But there are other things that you don't really think about: your manner on the phone, how quickly you respond to emails, your tone, all these little things that sometimes are actually invaluable in navigating working life, that can be lost when you're just focusing perhaps on the big issues. But obviously, forewarned is forearmed, and there are ways to combat any of these problems that may arise. So ultimately, what about working from a location that's neither home nor office? So we've touched on hybrid working, home working, but there's also an increasing request for some people to work in, for instance, office or a shared space that's local to them, but it's not actually in their house, and it's not at the workplace. So ACAS guidance suggests that employees may request to do this. They can work to rather than working from home or the workplace, they want to work elsewhere, then that's absolutely something that they're entitled to do. But in practical terms, obviously, it's not specifically it's not been specifically envisaged under the legislation. So you don't have an obligation ultimately to accommodate that request. But I think generally, as we've been saying, it's not usually sensible for an employer to reject a flexible working request on the basis that they're asking to work from a shared space, for instance, without first considering it. So if someone, for instance, wants to work in their local coffee shop, you might have confidentiality issues, IT issues, and these would be obviously very reasonable concerns and possible reasons to reject it. But as we say, increasingly, there are kind of shared workspaces and office space that are geared up to allow confidentiality, to allow kind of quiet zones, things like that. So it may be more difficult to refuse that, but ultimately an employee doesn't have the absolute right to request to work from such a space that's neither home nor office or workplace, if that makes sense. But again, ultimately, these things are all just about having dialogue with the employee. Why does it help? Maybe it reduces commuting costs, things like that, and going through any concerns that you may have in a way that hopefully would allow these to be resolved to accommodate the request. Gareth, I don't know if you've got some kind of concluding remarks.
The only thing I was going to mention that we haven't touched on is just how things have obviously changed quite a lot in the last couple of years, and how they might change further. We mentioned earlier the kind of eligibility requirements, so an employee needing 26 weeks service before they can make that request. Something that keeps coming up from time to time in kind of proposals to change that right is in respect of whether that should become a day one right. So there shouldn't need to be a service period for it. Employees should be able to ask immediately for those requests, given that it is relatively easy for an employer to reject requests. What's the harm in letting someone request that from day one? Equally, some people you do sometimes get calls for that being a kind of pre-employment right. So should applicants for jobs be entitled to kind of apply for what might have been advertised as, say, a full-time job, and apply for that and say that, well, as part of my application as well, I'd like to request that the job be done slightly differently. Now, I can imagine employers bristling at that and thinking, well, I've said what I need, why can someone apply for saying they want to do it in a different way? But it's just the way that the culture's shifting, and there is an increased, even if not quite going that far, there is an increased trend at the moment for, and maybe you might see this from time to time in job application adverts that will say, look, it's envisaged that this role is this set of hours, this working pattern, this work location, but we are open to flexibility applications as well, to not put off people that might be an excellent candidate who reads that application and thinks, well, I couldn't work on a Friday or a Monday, so I'm not going to apply for that job. And it just gives them that opportunity. So there's talk about there's always pressure to kind of formalize that, but a lot of employers are already doing that and inviting those applications. So that's the kind of space where things might be continuing to change as expectation of what work looks like and what work balance looks like continues. It's that kind of area that we might see further development. So I just wanted to add that, really. And other than that, I think that's pretty much everything we wanted to go through. Gives us a little bit of time now at the end for any questions, if anyone's got any. Be interested if people have seen within their own businesses, if they've seen increased numbers of applications. We've certainly seen more and more from different from all walks of life, really, from different levels, different businesses, different types of businesses, different level of employees, making these requests. So be interested if anyone else has that same experience. And any other questions anyone might have on any topic?
Hi, I've got a question.
Hi, Becky.
Hi.
Hi, just Julie mentioned about compressed hours. Can you just confirm what they are? Because we've not come across it before.
Yeah, so compressed hours means, say you do a 35-hour working week, that you continue to do your 35 hours, but you don't work the traditional Monday through Friday. Instead, you work longer days, and usually, so I know two people who do it, and usually in my kind of social circle, and it just means they work longer days and they get a day off, but they're not, so they're receiving the same amount of salary, they're doing the same amount of work. Obviously not all businesses, will be geared up for that, because obviously it means, for instance, my husband works till 7 o'clock at night, so that won't suit some businesses if there's nothing to do after 5:30, for instance. But if it can be accommodated, then that's what happens. You work long days, but fewer days. Although there are various machinations of it, but it essentially means you continue to do your number of hours. And it's intense, more intense and compressed throughout the working week.
Yeah, and because of that, it's an important one to kind of weigh up in the round with employees, depending on what they're doing, because it's quite easy to think, well, I'll get the extra day off at the end of the week by just squeezing all my hours in earlier in the week, but that may not always be the best thing. Certainly, as Julie says, it might not be the best thing for the business, but it might not be the best thing for the employee either. Is it ideal that they work a much longer day than they otherwise would? Are they going to be able to be as productive? Are they going to be able to, is that going to be good for their health and well-being and things like that? So there's a big picture to kind of weigh up, but yeah, that's becoming a trend. It's similar in a way, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar in a way to this idea that's been going around, and a few businesses have trialed it in a professional services type setting, or a kind of office-based setting, where you get these 4-day weeks and people get paid the same. They may not necessarily be expected to contractually do a lot more hours, and it shifts more towards output, and it's a basis of you can deliver the same output across 4 days and get the well-being benefits and the rest benefits of having that extra, and the work-life balance of having that extra day off. The business is still paying out the same, getting the same output, but the employees are not just this idea of, I suppose, people coming in on a Friday, and then by Friday afternoon, everyone's just throwing mini basketballs around the office because they're just bored and they're waiting to go to the pub. Like, just businesses realising, is that great, dragging people in to do stuff like that? Do we get as much out of people in that spell, or would we be better saying, look, we're more bothered about your output, get that done through the week, and then finish earlier, or have that there? And there's all sorts of different reasons for that. And a few businesses are trying it, and there's even talk that should be the kind of future. And 20 years from now, that's what most people will be doing. That kind of argument, and we'll see. But the compressed hours thing is more specifically, as Julie says, about cramming those specific hours into a shorter period of time, and it can work really well for some people, but maybe not necessarily for others.
And it's a way, I suppose, as well of rewarding employees without maybe giving salary increases, which is obviously becoming something more difficult. So you can say, well, you get the same salary, but you're doing the same, but the same essentially amount of work, but you're getting that kind of bonus of time off, and that can obviously encourage loyalty, improve morale. So
it's going to be different for different kind of businesses. Obviously, for you guys, Becky and Sue, your operational side, it's not going to apply for that, because people are doing physically there to do a physical job during opening time. So the compressing hours doesn't necessarily
I'm thinking for myself. I know she's thinking about herself. I'm already saying no chance. No chance. But in terms of flexible working requests, we deal with them quite a lot.
Yeah.
Well, Becky does anyway. But we have to always consider trading hours of the store because sometimes they don't fit the needs of our business. So it has to be built around, you know, trading patterns, and we've negotiated previously, you know, with an individual to say, you know, that suggestion doesn't work, but how about looking at this?
Yeah.
So we've normally come to some agreement to all of our flexible working requests. So,
and that's a really good approach to take with it, because that just creates a positive environment. Positive, you're viewed positively by your employees. But you're absolutely right. You know, if everyone was asking to work at a time when, you know, we're lucky to get one customer through the door in the first at 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning or something, but they're all asking to work then, it's not going to work. And that's completely legitimate, and that fits easily within one of those grounds that we saw that, you know, there isn't the work there to do, or, you know, various other ones that probably fit up it.
We've even just sorry,
on you go, Sue.
We've even recently just agreed for a store manager to work flexible hours around childcare. So she's now got 2 children, come back to work full time, and we're working around her childcare. So even for the store managers, it's possible.
The only point I was going to make there as well is that if you do have employees working compressed hours, which generally means longer working days, just obviously make sure as well that you've kind of touched on the working time regulations, but rest breaks and all the rest of it, which usually isn't an issue, but just something to bear in mind.
But that example seems a good one, because if you didn't necessarily take that approach, or you weren't as accommodating where you could be, you easily find yourself in a scenario where, you know, all our store managers are going to be they're going to be blokes who don't need to stereotypically take that, make those requests, and you end up with a less diverse workforce, and good managers being put off doing that role because I won't be able to do it around my other commitments. So what's the point of becoming a manager? And then you don't get that benefit of the more diverse workforce.
I do think we would have lost her if we wouldn't have agreed it. And she works. Her store is just amazing. We don't get any problems with her store. So
why wouldn't you accommodate if you can? Obviously, that'll have to fit into what the business needs. But yeah, of course, you're going to accommodate that. You don't want to lose that person. Recruit someone to build up and get to that same level could take years. So yeah, it's a good example of why you would have that approach. Questions from anyone?
Hi Gareth, it's Joan. I have a question.
Hi.
I was just curious actually whether there would be an appeal process. So if there was there was a request for this flexible working, and the company refused it with stating one of the reasons why, but is there an appeal that the employees can go through, or for unreasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. You should always give a right to appeal, and that would usually be set out in your flexible working policy. You absolutely should give a right to appeal, just as you would in kind of a grievance process or anything like that. That would be considered part of dealing with a request in a reasonable manner. And it can just be as simple as, if they want to ask another person to reconsider the decision, they might not have any new arguments to make, but it's just useful as an employer to kind of show that, we made our original decision, and then we had someone else cast their eye on it when you asked them to reconsider. They agree, they disagree. It's much harder for any employee to say that it hasn't been handled reasonably if you've gone through that 2-stage process. So absolutely, you would have that, that appeal process would be involved, and it would be dealt with by someone new. So if you've got the resources available to do this, that is, you'd have someone who hasn't dealt with it before, ideally someone that's more senior, that has the power to overturn or change that original decision, just as any other appeal. But yeah, absolutely best practice to have that appeal process.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Any more? We've got a couple more minutes if anyone's got any other questions.
Sorry, I've got another one.
Okay.
So we had a team member recently who put in a flexible working request that was agreed. And then a few months later, she split up from a partner and had to change those hours that she'd agreed to fit round childcare. It worked for the store, so we did actually agree to it. Were we okay to do that? Because obviously she'd already had a first request, and then you're not supposed to request one for another 12 months.
Yeah, absolutely. There's not that 12-month rule is not necessarily, you know, it ties everyone's hands and you can't do it. Employees will still ask, and you, in terms of your general approach to employee management, would have a think about considering that, and if you're happy to accommodate it or to consider it, then absolutely. The thing with the 12-month thing is it just gives you that chance to push back if someone's continually chopping and changing and asking for different requests all the time, and it's getting disruptive and that kind of thing. It's just to prevent that kind of thing. But when someone's had a life event that changes and they make a request, it will usually be good practice to consider that. It doesn't necessarily look great as an employer to say, well, when we're not really very empathetic to what's gone on in your situation, we've got the 12-month grace period, so we're not going to consider it. There could be other complaints that would come in from the employee as well.
Yeah. Well, again, she was a good worker, so we didn't want to lose her.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and it worked for the store, so that was fine. And we put in her letter to confirm that it was her second request, an amendment to the original hours, and that we were happy to go ahead.
Yeah.
So we've done everything okay there then.
Absolutely, and that's a good point as well. We didn't really touch on that. Well, we kind of touched on it, but just as a reminder, any requests that are granted as well, they should obviously all be confirmed in writing with all the dates there and very clear about what's happened, just so there's no confusion or ambiguity about what's changed under the contract. Doesn't mean you have to be issued a brand new contract. You can have kind of what we might call a side letter that confirms that the contract's still the same, except from this date onwards, this is your new working pattern. And that sits alongside the contract in their personnel file and confirms that contractual change.
Yeah, and on that point, you sometimes might want to build in a trial period, so you might not want to change the person's contract initially. So you might be saying, we've agreed for to accede to your request, but we're going to try it for 4 weeks, and if after the 4 weeks we're happy with it, then we'll make that a contractual change. Because I think that's sometimes something that is lost on employees, that their contract is being changed permanently, that it's they don't then have a right to say this doesn't suit me or whatever, and I just want to go back to full time. You've actually you've changed their contract of employment, and that is now what you're both parties are obliged to fulfill. And if they wanted to go back, it would technically be a flexible working request, but it's obviously at your discretion to allow and to accommodate the needs of the business as well as the employee.
We've got time for one more if anyone's got a question. No? Well, if anything does...
I was going to say, I don't have a question, but it is food for thought, because during the time that I've been here at Endless Game, which has been the last 7 months, I have not been made aware of any requests for flexible working, which is an interesting one. It just makes me think about I'm sure there's got to have been a period of time where there has been a request at some point. But we have moved to remote working. I've just been thinking, as we've been told, thinking, okay, we've moved to remote working. And I'm just thinking about kind of the demographics and people's responsibilities, and I know the team quite well. So in thinking about it, it's probably quite likely that there just hasn't fallen in that way. But I will definitely be asking Gary when he returns back from annual leave.
He's normally on top of everything, so I'd imagine I'd imagine that it's been done the right way. Sometimes as well, and it's not necessarily for us as lawyers to say, you must follow these really laborious processes just for the sake of it. Sometimes these requests are made and it's agreed you know, it's agreed really quickly, and it's just like, yeah, that's fine if that's what you want to do. And there's no need to necessarily go through all these processes and meetings and things. That's a completely legitimate way of doing it. You'd still, and this would be the loyalty part of it, you would still want to confirm what's been agreed in writing to say, you know, we had this request, you asked this, well, we're happy with that, here's the change to the contract type of thing. But yeah, there's absolutely no need to necessarily go through all those meetings and appeals and all of that when, yeah, you're perfectly happy to accommodate it without further consideration. So
I think this is already flexible arrangements when I think about it and think, well, actually, you know, you can start an hour, a little bit. Yeah, they're very flexible here, I suppose. Maybe that's probably most likely on we are remote. But it just got me thinking. I thought, oh, that's interesting, because then you start to think, well, actually, you know, are people more conscious of maybe putting a request in? Is there any reasons for that? But I'm sure that's not the case. But yeah, just interesting.
It's good to reflect. Yeah, it's good to reflect like that, because I suppose some businesses might at times think, well, if this is something that we're keen to promote, but we're not getting any uptake, and we're worried that actually people are not requesting stuff they would want to ask for because they're scared, or they think that they might get frowned upon. Do we need to change it? Do we need to change the messaging and remind people that they can make those requests? I'm not necessarily encouraging you to suddenly start telling people that if you want to make requests, make some, but sometimes
it's the point, isn't it?
Businesses might reflect and think, are we encouraging the right kind of flexibility? Are we having some issues that we could address in a different way? So like I said earlier, the person that they're getting lots of absenteeism and thinking, well, are people just getting tired and burnt out and needing time off, so they're going on sick? And if we actually approach flexible working differently, we would just be in a much more positive approach to the same resolving the issue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And you can also find that remote working itself negates the need for people to have other types of flexible working, because they don't have that commute time, so potentially their working days shorter, so they can do the school run without, for instance, that being a particular issue, so that they may not need further flexibility once the remote is.
I mean, people definitely, you know, do what they're doing at home. You can tell that because, you know, Teams is quite a good measure of that, isn't it? If you're away for long periods of time, and everyone's really flexible with that, particularly in terms of remote working. So I think all of that kind of helps.
Modern working life. It's keeping us all on our toes.
Yeah,
absolutely. No, there's absolutely no remote workers watching football matches or anything like that going on. So unless anyone else has anything more to add, I think that brings us to the end. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to be taking a break next month. We're not going to do one in December, because by the time we get around to this sort of, we'd have to do these towards the end of the month, and we'll be into that last Christmas week. So I think everyone will have other things on their mind at that point. So we'll get back together in January. So look out for that. Previously we've mentioned if anyone's got any ideas for future topics on this. We've had a few suggestions which we will work into the programme, but if anyone has any other ideas of things they would want to see covered in this sort of way, then please do feel free to email me or Julie, and also email us if you do have any follow-up questions from what we've discussed today. And that's it. Thanks everyone.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Christmas.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, have a good one.
See you next year.
Thank you.
Bye.